My name is Claire Monroe. I'm 28, and I grew up always hearing the same comparison. Madison, my sister, was the shining star, the one who never seemed to stumble. I was the other daughter, the one who was told to try harder to be more like her. At first I thought I could live with being second best, but as the years went on, the words cut deeper and the silence inside me grew heavier. Until one night, in front of family and neighbors, my mother sneered in a way that made something inside me finally break. What happened at that table changed everything, and once the truth came out, there was no way back. Do you want to know how a single sentence turned an entire Christmas night upside down? Let me take you back to where it began. I was 28 years old when I finally admitted to myself that I had spent most of my life living in someone else's shadow. My name is Claire Monroe, and if you had asked anyone in my family while I was growing up, they would have told you that my sister Madison was the star. I was the other daughter, the one people smiled at politely and then turned back to the real conversation. That shadow stretched over everything from the time I was a little girl coloring with crayons at our kitchen table to the day I walked across the stage at community college to pick up my degree. When I was 8 years old, I remember sitting in the hallway at Ridgewood Elementary while my mom met with my teacher. I could hear every word through the door. Mr. Peterson, my fifth-grade teacher, told my mom that I was a sweet girl, but that I lacked the natural drive that Madison had. I sat there swinging my legs, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor, already knowing what was coming. A few minutes later, Mom walked out, her lips pressed tight, and on the car ride home she said, I really needed to try harder, that Madison had already been chosen to represent her class at the spelling bee, and wasn't that wonderful? I nodded, pretending I was fine, but I stared out the window fighting tears the whole way home. Those moments piled up year after year. When I scored an 88 on an algebra test, Mom reminded me that Madison had been taking advanced calculus as a sophomore. When I joined the junior varsity soccer team, she smiled but quickly said that Madison had been varsity captain at the same age. No achievement of mine could stand on its own. It always came with a comparison. I found refuge in art class. I loved the smell of the paints and the way a brush felt in my hand. I poured myself into canvases, convinced that maybe here I would be seen. When I was 17, I won first prize at the Franklin County Art Fair for an oil painting of the old red barn on my grandparents' property. I was so proud, carrying that ribbon home, hoping maybe this time my mom would beam at me the way she always did at Madison. She glanced at the painting and said it was nice, then immediately asked if I had heard that Madison had been selected for another scholarship competition. I still remember the way my ribbon sagged in my hand, suddenly feeling small and silly. At our house in Columbus, the difference was visible to anyone who walked in. The mantel over the fireplace was lined with Madison's trophies, debate team photos, and certificates. My school picture sat in a small frame off to the side, partly hidden behind one of her awards. At graduation, I sat somewhere in the middle of my class while Madison stood at the podium as valedictorian. Relatives swarmed her afterward, asking about her plans at Columbia Law, while I stood by the punch bowl clutching a cup and nodding politely when someone asked what I would do next. I told them I was planning to attend Columbus Community College for graphic design. The responses were always the same. At least you're continuing your education. That phrase echoed in my ears, never said with pride, always with a tinge of disappointment. My mom never meant to be cruel in her own mind. She thought she was pushing me, but to me it felt like death by 1,000 cuts. I learned to plaster on a smile, to act like I didn't care. But every time she looked at me and said, I should be more like Madison, something inside me cracked a little more. There was one night in particular I still see clearly. I was 16, standing in the kitchen washing dishes. Mom walked in holding the mail. She opened a thick envelope and gasped. Madison had been offered a full ride to Columbia. Mom hugged her, tears in her eyes, and shouted for Dad. They all celebrated in the living room for hours, the phone ringing off the hook with relatives calling to congratulate. I stayed in the kitchen, hands wet with dishwater, staring at the plate in front of me. I wanted to be happy for my sister, but the silence in that kitchen felt heavier than anything. That was my role for years, smiling in the background, washing dishes, clapping politely. And as much as I told myself I didn't mind, the truth was that each of those moments carved a permanent space inside me, a space filled with hurt and longing that never quite went away. By the time I was in my 20s, the comparisons had become so normal that I almost didn't notice them. At family dinners, Mom would tell everyone that Madison was on track at Sterling & Cole in Chicago, that she had already been noticed by senior partners, and wasn't that incredible? Then she would turn to me and say Claire is doing some design work for local businesses. I would smile, sip my drink, and feel myself shrink a little smaller. Looking back, it is almost strange how numb I became. I thought that was simply how my life was supposed to be. Madison shined and I stayed in the shadows. What I didn't know back then was that the years of silence and swallowed pride were slowly building toward a moment when I would no longer be able to stay quiet. That moment was still far off, but the first cracks had already formed, and I could feel them even if I didn't yet understand what they meant. Madison was always the one people wanted to talk about. By the time she finished Columbia Law, she had already landed a position at Sterling & Cole, one of the top law firms in Chicago. Every phone call from relatives, every holiday card from family friends had a line asking how Madison was doing, how impressive it must be to have such a successful daughter. My mom soaked it in. She carried a scrapbook filled with clippings of articles about Madison, little announcements in the legal journal, photos of her at charity galas with senior partners. That book never left the coffee table. When I came home after finishing my degree at Columbus Community College, I told Mom I had been hired at a small marketing agency downtown. She smiled politely and said that was nice, then added that Madison's professors had written glowing recommendations and she was already handling case research most graduates would never touch. I laughed it off, but inside I felt like a balloon that had just lost its air. The agency where I worked paid the bills, but the atmosphere was suffocating. The partners favored big clients and dismissed smaller creative work as fluff. I spent hours making local business ads and logos only to hear my boss chuckle and call it my little art job. He liked to remind me that the agency only kept me because I was fast with Photoshop and easy to manage. I would drive home in traffic, staring at the gray Ohio sky and wonder how Madison's evenings in Chicago looked compared to mine. Mom made sure I knew. Every Sunday, she called me into the living room when Madison phoned. She always put the call on speaker so I could hear about the partners she was networking with, the conferences she attended, the way she was already on track for promotion. I sat there on the couch, hands folded, nodding, as if I were part of the conversation. When the call ended, Mom would sigh with pride and then glance at me with a softer smile, asking how my little projects were going. One evening after work, I dropped by the house and found Mom in the kitchen talking to our neighbor, Mrs. Coleman. They were sipping coffee while Madison's picture in her law school graduation gown sat on the counter like a centerpiece. Mrs. Coleman gushed about how amazing it must feel to have such an accomplished daughter. Mom's face lit up, her voice rising with excitement as she talked about Madison's condo in Chicago and her invitations to fundraising dinners. Then Mrs. Coleman asked what I was doing these days. Mom barely looked up as she said Claire is doing some design work for small companies in Columbus. The way she said it made me feel invisible, like I was standing right there but had somehow disappeared from the conversation. I started to realize that if I stayed at that agency, I would wither away completely. The comments, the comparisons, the dismissals were constant reminders that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. So I quit. I turned in my badge, cleared my desk, and walked out without a plan except for one. I would work for myself. The first few months of freelancing were brutal. I sat at my kitchen table with a second-hand laptop and stacks of unpaid bills. I reached out to anyone who might need design work, from local diners to church groups. Some weeks I barely made enough to cover rent, but there was a strange freedom in it. Every design was mine, every deadline my responsibility. For the first time, I felt like I was steering my own ship instead of sitting quietly in the back seat of someone else's car. Mom did not see it that way. She called my choice reckless. She told me Madison had stability and respect while I was chasing hobbies. She compared my freelance clients with Madison's corporate cases, reminding me that no small business brochure would ever look as good on a resume as a court victory. I tried to defend myself, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. The comparisons reached a peak at Thanksgiving that year. The entire Monroe family gathered at our house. Madison arrived with Daniel Carter, the young doctor she had been dating. They looked like they had stepped out of a magazine. Daniel in his pressed suit, Madison in a sleek navy dress, both smiling like they were already featured in society pages. Relatives crowded around them, asking about Madison's firm and Daniel's residency. I stood near the dessert table, arranging pies, answering polite questions about logos and websites no one really cared about. During dinner, Uncle Henry raised his glass to Madison, saying how proud everyone was to see her making it big in Chicago. Mom beamed, and Dad clapped his hands against the table with a wide grin. When the toast was done, Aunt Margaret leaned toward me and asked if I was still doing little art projects. I nodded my throat tight and said yes. She patted my hand kindly, as if I were a child playing dress-up. That night, as I cleared plates and loaded the dishwasher, I heard laughter coming from the living room. Madison was telling a story about one of her firm's partners, inviting her to a gala at the Art Institute. Everyone hung on her words. I wiped down the counters, the smell of turkey and pumpkin pie still lingering in the air, and felt the familiar ache in my chest. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I worked, I was always the footnote in a story where Madison was the headline. It was around that time that I began to feel something shifting inside me. The pride I once had for my sister started to sour into something heavier. I still loved her, but I was tired of being measured against her every second of my life. I was tired of being invisible in my own home. I wanted to be seen, truly seen, not just tolerated. That need grew stronger with every passing family gathering, every Sunday phone call, every dismissive smile. And though I did not yet know it, the day was coming, when I would finally step out of the shadows, not just for a moment but for good. Madison had a way of making her life look effortless. When she introduced Daniel Carter to the family, he seemed like the perfect piece in her already polished puzzle. He was 34, a cardiologist in Chicago with a condo downtown and a Tesla parked in his garage. He shook hands, firmly remembered everyone's names, and charmed my aunts and uncles within minutes. Mom practically floated around the room each time he spoke, her smile stretched wider than I had ever seen it. I watched from across the living room as Daniel told stories about his patients and the conferences he had attended. Madison rested her hand lightly on his arm, laughing at just the right moments, glowing in a way that made me feel like I was standing in the wrong movie. My plate of appetizers balanced on my knee felt heavier with each round of laughter that followed him. At one point, Aunt Margaret leaned close to me and whispered how lucky Madison was to have found such a wonderful man, then added that he came from a family of doctors, too. I nodded politely, the familiar sting rising in my chest. No one had ever leaned close to say I was lucky for anyone I had brought home. Years earlier, I had dated Mark Dawson, a photographer who ran a small studio on High Street. He had a way of seeing light and capturing moments that made ordinary people look extraordinary. He believed in me when I said I wanted to start freelancing, even offered to take professional photos of my work for my portfolio. I thought he might be the one. Mom never gave him a chance. From the first dinner, she asked what his long-term plan was and whether he had a retirement account. She told me later in the kitchen that a career in photography was unstable and that Madison's boyfriend at the time, a med student, was proof of what real security looked like. Her words clung to me like burrs. I began second-guessing Mark, wondering if his dreams were too fragile, if maybe I was making a mistake, tying myself to someone without a clear financial ladder. Those doubts grew louder, until one night, after an argument about money and my family's constant criticism, he packed a bag and said he could not be with someone who did not believe in him. I cried for days, but even then I knew it was my mother's voice echoing through me that had ended us. Watching Madison with Daniel, I could not help but think of Mark and the life I might have had if I had been braver. Instead, I stood at the edge of conversations, clutching a glass of wine, listening to Mom tell Daniel how proud she was of Madison and how she had always known her daughter would marry someone of his caliber. That fall, Madison turned 30, and Mom planned a birthday party that looked more like a wedding reception. The banquet hall was decorated with white linen's gold accents and an ice sculpture shaped like the scales of justice. I arrived early to help set up, carrying trays of cupcakes and arranging centerpieces, while Madison and Mom supervised the florist. When the guests filled the room, Daniel took the microphone to make a toast. He spoke about Madison's dedication to her work, her compassion for people, and how she made him want to be better every day. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. Gasps rippled across the room. Mom covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks as Madison nodded through her own tears. The applause was thunderous. Relatives rushed forward to hug them. Flashes from cameras lit the room. I clapped too, because what else could I do, but my hands felt like they belonged to someone else. I stood on the edge of that glittering circle, the music and chatter swirling around me, and wondered if anyone noticed that I was the only one without a partner. The only one not being toasted or photographed. After the ring was admired, and the champagne poured, Aunt Margaret found me at the dessert table. She asked when it would be my turn. I laughed softly and said I was focused on my business. She patted my arm and said that was nice, but reminded me not to wait too long, that good men did not stay single forever. The party stretched late into the night, filled with dancing and speeches. I slipped out quietly to the parking lot, the cold autumn air hitting my face as I breathed deeply, trying to shake off the weight in my chest. Across the lot, I could see Madison and Daniel surrounded by friends, their laughter floating into the night. Driving home, the headlights of passing cars blurred with the tears in my eyes. I thought about Mark, about the way he had once told me that love was about believing in each other when no one else did. I had not believed in him, not enough, and now he was gone. And here was Madison with Daniel, the kind of man my mother had always dreamed her daughters would marry, except it was only ever meant for one of us. I pulled into my apartment complex, turned off the engine, and sat in the silence. My hands gripped the steering wheel long after the car cooled. I told myself I should be happy for my sister, and in some ways I was. But beneath that, a quiet anger smoldered. I was tired of being measured against a standard I never asked, tired of being told that my choices, my love, my work were less than hers. That anger settled deep, waiting for the day when it would finally find a voice. It was early July when the phone rang, and my mother's voice broke through the static, frantic and unsteady. She told me Dad had collapsed at work, and an ambulance was rushing him to Mount Carmel Hospital. I grabbed my keys without even putting on shoes and drove across town, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the traffic around me. The emergency room smelled of antiseptic and fear. I found Mom pacing near the reception desk, her hands trembling as she tried to explain to the nurse who she was waiting for. When she saw me, she burst into tears and fell against my shoulder. Hours dragged on, doctors and nurses coming and going, their faces grim but professional. Finally, a surgeon came out and told us Dad had suffered a major heart attack. They had stabilized him, but his recovery would be long and difficult. When I stepped into the ICU and saw him lying there with tubes and monitors surrounding him, the world seemed to tilt. Dad had always been strong, the man who walked the halls of Lincoln High as principal, with authority and respect. Seeing him so fragile broke something inside me. I held his hand and whispered that I was there, though I was not sure he could hear me. The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, paperwork, and hushed conversations. The doctors explained that he would need months of rehabilitation, and he would not be able to return to work anytime soon. Mom looked pale, as if she had aged years overnight. One afternoon, she sat with me in the hospital cafeteria and pulled out a small notepad where she had scribbled numbers. Mortgage payments, utilities, medical bills not covered by insurance. Her voice cracked as she said she did not know how they would manage. I stared at the columns of numbers, feeling the weight of them press against my chest. I did not have much, but I knew I had to do something. I told her I could cover the mortgage for now, at least, until Dad was back on his feet. She hesitated, her brow furrowed, then asked if I was sure. She reminded me that my freelance business was still just getting by. The words stung, but I nodded firmly. I could not stand by while the house I grew up in was at risk. That night I opened my laptop and started reaching out to every contact I had. I said yes to every project, no matter how small or exhausting. I designed logos for bakeries' menus, for diners' websites, for churches. My days stretched into 12 and 14 hours of non-stop work. Coffee replaced meals, and my apartment floor was littered with empty takeout containers. Still, the payments went through. I drove to the bank and handed over checks that drained nearly all of my savings. One evening, as I handed Mom an envelope with the mortgage payment tucked inside, she sighed and said she hoped I knew what I was doing. Then she added that Madison was tied up with a big case in Chicago, and it would be unfair to bother her. My jaw tightened, but I said nothing. Visiting Dad became both heartbreaking and motivating. He tried to smile each time I walked in, though the effort tired him. One afternoon, he squeezed my hand and whispered that he hated being a burden. I told him he was not, that family took care of each other. My throat burned as I said it, knowing how often I had been told I was less than in this very family. Still, I meant every word. Meanwhile, Mom spoke endlessly about Madison. How Madison had sent flowers for Dad's room, how Madison called every evening with advice about doctors, how Madison was balancing so much, but still thought of them. I listened, biting my tongue, while knowing that the bills on the counter were paid with money I earned, not with bouquets or phone calls. One Sunday, I stopped by the house and saw a pile of letters from the bank stacked on the dining room table. Mom had not even opened them. I tore one open and saw the overdue notice. My chest tightened with panic. I drove straight to the branch the next morning, sat with a loan officer, and arranged to bring the account current. My hand shook as I signed the papers committing nearly all of my emergency fund. Walking back to my car, I felt both proud and hollow. When I gave Mom the receipt later that week, she thanked me distractedly, already talking about Madison's upcoming trip with Daniel. My stomach turned, but I forced a smile. It was not the first time my sacrifices had gone unnoticed, and I doubted it would be the last. Still, there was a quiet fire building inside me. Every check I wrote, every late night spent, hunched over my laptop, every tired morning driving to the hospital, reminded me that I was not weak. I was holding this family together even if no one wanted to admit it. One evening, I sat by Dad's bedside watching the monitors beep steadily. The soft light from the machines cast shadows across his face, and I realized how much I loved this man who had given me quiet encouragement through the years. I promised myself that whatever it took, I would not let him come home to a foreclosure notice or a house darkened by unpaid bills. The irony was sharp. Madison was in Chicago, celebrated at galas and climbing her professional ladder, while I was here in Columbus, quietly carrying the weight no one else wanted to acknowledge. And yet when relatives called, they heard all about Madison's victories. My name rarely came up except as an afterthought. As the weeks turned into months, the hospital became a second home. Nurses greeted me by name, and I knew which vending machine had the least stale sandwiches. I watched leaves change outside the window, summer slipping into fall, while the stack of receipts and bank statements in my purse grew thicker. One cold evening in November, I left the hospital and drove past our family home. Lights twinkled on the porch, a wreath already hung on the door. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment. The house looked warm and inviting from the outside, but I knew how fragile it really was, balanced on the edge of bills and debt. My stomach twisted as I thought about the holiday season ahead. I stepped inside to find Mom arranging catalogs for holiday decorations, her eyes bright as she talked about hosting Christmas dinner. She did not mention the mortgage I had just paid or the hours I had poured into making it possible. She only talked about Madison coming home and how proud she was to show Daniel what a real family gathering looked like. I smiled faintly and nodded, the familiar ache returning. Inside, though, I knew that something was shifting. I was no longer just the quiet daughter in the corner. I was the one keeping the lights on, the one saving the home we all lived in. Even if no one admitted it yet, the truth was waiting, building, ready to come out when the time was right. My alarm rang at 6 every morning, and by 7 I was already at my laptop, coffee in hand, scrolling through emails from clients. The projects came faster than I could have imagined. A local diner needed a new menu, a church wanted flyers for a Thanksgiving fundraiser, a small boutique begged me to design their holiday campaign before Black Friday. I said yes to everything. I could not afford to turn anything down. The days blurred together. I woke, I worked. I grabbed whatever food I could find, and I worked again. My hands cramped from long hours at the keyboard, my eyes burned from staring at screens. But I kept going. Every invoice I sent, every check that cleared, went straight to the mortgage, to the hospital, to the endless stream of utility bills. I joked to myself that my dining table had turned into an office, and my office into a battlefield where the only weapon was determination. By mid-November, I had spent nearly $20,000 of my savings and earnings covering for my parents. I kept a folder on my desk with receipts and bank slips, as if I needed proof for myself that this was real. Some nights I would spread them out across the table, staring at the numbers until they blurred together, wondering how long I could keep this up before I broke. One evening, exhausted and hungry, I called Mom to check in. She answered cheerfully, her voice brighter than I expected. She talked about the Christmas lights she planned to hang on the porch, how she wanted to order a fresh pine wreath from the garden center, and how Madison and Daniel would be driving in for the holidays. I waited for her to ask how I was holding up, or to thank me for the payment I had just dropped at the bank. She never did. Instead, she asked if I could pick up new table linens for Christmas dinner. I bit back my frustration and said yes. There were nights when I cried quietly into my pillow, the weight of it all pressing down on me. My friends invited me out, but I always said I was too busy. The truth was, I did not have the energy or the money for socializing. My phone lit up with pictures on Instagram of smiling faces at restaurants and concerts, while I sat in sweatpants surrounded by sketches and half-finished projects. Still, there was a stubborn part of me that refused to quit. Every time I thought about the house, the mortgage letters with red warnings, the image of Dad lying helpless in the hospital, I pushed harder. If I collapsed, everything else would collapse with me. One afternoon in late November, I visited Dad at Mount Carmel. His color had improved and he managed a weak smile when I walked in. I told him about my projects, how a restaurant chain had just asked me to design their winter ads. His hand squeezed mine, and his eyes welled up with pride. For once I felt seen. It was a small moment, but it kept me going. At home, though, the story was different. Mom kept praising Madison's long hours at the firm, how she was tackling high-profile cases, even while planning her wedding. Mom spoke as if sending flowers to the hospital was the same as paying bills. I listened, nodding my jaw tight, knowing full well who was actually keeping the lights on. One Saturday I stopped by to help set up Christmas decorations. Mom had boxes of ornaments and strings of lights spread across the living room. As I untangled the cords, she chattered about how Madison was considering a designer gown and how Daniel wanted to host the rehearsal dinner at a country club in Chicago. I plugged in the lights and watched them flicker to life, thinking about the electric bill I had paid just days before. Later that evening, as I left, I glanced back at the house glowing warmly against the cold night. It looked beautiful, inviting, like the perfect picture of a family holiday. But I knew the truth. Every strand of lights, every ornament, every flame of the furnace was burning on the fuel of my sacrifice. The closer Christmas drew, the heavier it felt. I tried to keep up with my freelance work while also running errands for Mom, groceries, decorations, gift wrapping. I said nothing about the long hours or the way my savings account kept shrinking. I simply showed up, smiling faintly, doing what needed to be done. One night, I collapsed on my couch after finishing a website redesign for a bakery. My hands shook from exhaustion, and tears slid down my cheeks before I could stop them. I thought about Madison sipping cocktails at a gala, Daniel standing proudly beside her while I scraped together energy to meet deadlines no one would ever brag about. The bitterness cut deep, but so did the quiet knowledge that without me, our family would be drowning. By the first week of December, the house was fully decorated, and Mom was busy inviting relatives and neighbors for Christmas dinner. I helped her finalize the guest list, listening as she spoke with excitement about showing Daniel how warm and welcoming our family could be. She never once mentioned the bills or the fact that I had covered every cost of that warmth. As I drove home that night, snow began to fall in soft flakes against the windshield. I gripped the wheel tightly, the world outside white, and still, while inside me a storm churned. I was exhausted, invisible, and angry, but I also felt a flicker of something else. Strength. The truth was piling up like snowdrifts, silent and heavy, waiting for the moment it would all come tumbling down. The invitation list kept growing until it felt like half of Columbus was coming for Christmas dinner. Mom insisted on sending formal cards to relatives and even neighbors like Mrs. Coleman. She wanted everything perfect. I drove her to the party rental store to pick out linens and extra chairs, then carried them into the house while she talked about how proud she was that Madison and Daniel would see the family at its best. By the second week of December, the house smelled of cinnamon and pine. The porch glowed with twinkling lights, a fresh wreath hung on the door, and the dining room table was already set with silver chargers and sparkling glasses. I had been the one to swipe my card at the register, but no one besides me seemed to remember that. Mom bustled about the kitchen with a clipboard humming Christmas songs, asking me to run to the store for cranberries and candles. One night I stopped by after another 14-hour workday, still smelling of printer ink from a client meeting. The living room floor was covered in boxes of ornaments. Mom handed me a string of lights and asked me to hang them across the banister. As I worked, she kept talking about Madison and Daniel. She said Madison was swamped at the firm but still found time to order gourmet chocolates for Dad's nurses. She laughed as she said Daniel was flying in early so he could shovel the driveway if it snowed. I wrapped the lights tighter, biting my tongue, thinking about the hospital bills I had just paid online before driving over. The week before Christmas, I stopped by the house to drop off another envelope with the mortgage payment tucked inside. I placed it on the counter and poured myself a glass of water. Mom barely glanced at it before asking if I had picked up the white tablecloths she ordered. I answered yes, swallowing hard. She smiled faintly and went back to chopping onions. Dad was finally home from the hospital, moving slowly with a walker, but smiling more than he had in months. He thanked me every time I came by, his eyes soft and full of something Mom never showed. When I asked if he needed anything, he whispered that having me there was enough. I held on to those words like they were gold. The Saturday before Christmas, I drove them both to church for the annual holiday service. Everyone hugged Madison when she arrived, dressed in a deep green coat with Daniel at her side. People swarmed around them, asking about Chicago, the law firm, the upcoming wedding. I stood a few feet away, holding Dad's arm to steady him, feeling like a background character in someone else's story. After service, Mom invited everyone to Christmas dinner, promising a feast and a night to remember. She said Madison was bringing a special dessert from Chicago, and Daniel had offered to carve the turkey. I carried Dad's coat and tried to ignore the sting in my chest. On Christmas Eve, I worked late into the night, finishing a last-minute website for a client who had begged me to meet a deadline. At midnight, I finally closed my laptop and looked around my apartment. Wrapping paper scraps littered the floor. A pile of invoices sat on my desk, and my phone buzzed with new emails. My body ached, but I knew tomorrow I would have to be at my parents' house early to help Mom with the final preparations. Christmas morning arrived with a heavy sky, snowflakes drifting lazily down as I pulled into the driveway. The house was alive, with noise pots clanging in the kitchen, relatives already gathering in the living room. I carried in bags of groceries, set down bottles of wine, and helped Dad settle in his chair near the fireplace. By late afternoon, the dining table was covered in platters of food, from roasted vegetables to pies lined up in neat rows. The smell of turkey filled the air. Guests crowded in, shedding coats and scarves, laughter echoing through the house. Madison and Daniel arrived last, stepping inside like royalty. Madison wore a red dress that hugged her figure, and Daniel carried a bottle of champagne. Everyone rushed to greet them, leaving me standing by the doorway with snow still clinging to my boots. Mom's face glowed with pride as she led them into the dining room. She made sure Madison was seated at the head of the table with Daniel beside her. I took a seat near the end between Uncle Henry and Mrs. Coleman, quietly folding my napkin in my lap. The room buzzed with conversation about Chicago law firms and medical conferences. My name was barely mentioned. As dinner began, I moved back and forth from the kitchen, refilling platters, bringing out gravy boats, making sure everyone had what they needed. Mom walked behind me, patting my shoulder absent-mindedly, whispering that Madison looked radiant tonight. I nodded and carried on my chest tight. When the turkey was finally set on the table, Daniel rose with a smile and carved it gracefully while everyone applauded. Mom raised her glass, ready to make a toast. I froze for a moment, sensing that the evening was about to tilt in a direction none of us could ignore. Mom cleared her throat and lifted her glass high, her eyes shining with the reflection of the candles. She smiled at Madison as if no one else in the room existed. Her voice rang out over the clinking of forks and quiet chatter, telling everyone how proud she was to have a daughter who worked at one of the finest law firms in Chicago and was marrying a brilliant doctor. Then she looked directly at me, her smile fading into something sharper, and said that no matter what I did, I would always fall short of my sister. The words sliced through the room. For a moment, even the silverware stopped moving. I felt my cheeks flush hot, the sting of humiliation spreading across my skin as relatives shifted in their seats. Some looked down at their plates, others glanced nervously at Madison, but no one spoke. I sat frozen, gripping my napkin so tightly that the fabric twisted in my hand. My chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. For years I had swallowed comments like this, forcing a smile and pushing the hurt deep down. But something inside me snapped. My chair scraped against the hardwood as I stood, the sound sharp and jarring. Every head turned toward me. I steadied my voice, though my heart hammered in my chest. I told Mom that if Madison was so perfect, then perhaps she should be the one paying for the lights that glowed in the windows, the mortgage that kept the roof over our heads, and the bills that piled up each month. My words cut through the heavy silence, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Mom's glass trembled in her hand, and her eyes widened as if I had just spoken in a foreign language. Madison's smile faltered. Daniel's fork hovered halfway to his mouth. Uncle Henry cleared his throat but said nothing. Mrs. Coleman sat back in her chair, her eyes darting between us like she was watching a storm gather. I pushed my chair back from the table and walked toward the sideboard where my purse sat. My hands shook as I pulled out a thick folder filled with receipts, bank slips, and statements. I laid them flat on the table for everyone to see. My voice grew stronger as I explained that for months I had been working day and night, draining my savings, keeping the house from foreclosure, covering Dad's prescriptions, and even paying for tonight's dinner. Gasps filled the room. The sound of paper rustling seemed deafening as I spread the evidence across the white tablecloth. My mother's face paled. Madison stared at me as if she had been slapped. Daniel leaned forward, his brow furrowed, scanning the papers. I asked if anyone thought Madison's flowers for the hospital or her holiday chocolates had paid a single bill. My voice cracked with anger and exhaustion. I reminded them all that while they toasted Madison's brilliance and Daniel's success, I had been the one keeping the lights on the furnace, running the doors of this house open. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mom stammered that she had not realized that she thought I was just doing small projects here and there. I laughed bitterly and asked how she thought those envelopes kept landing on her counter each month. Did she think money appeared out of thin air? Daniel set down his fork and asked Madison if she knew any of this. Her lips parted, but no words came. She glanced at Mom, then back at him, her face red with embarrassment. He looked at me again, his expression full of questions. The air in the room felt thick, pressing down on us all. Relatives whispered quietly, shifting in their chairs. Aunt Margaret reached for her husband's hand. Mrs. Coleman shook her head, muttering that she had never realized. I stood tall, though my knees trembled beneath me. I said I was tired of being invisible, tired of being told I would never measure up, when in reality, I had been the one carrying the weight no one else wanted to see. My words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Mom lowered her glass, her hand unsteady, and finally sat down without saying another word. The proud glow in her face was gone, replaced by something small and shaken. Madison's eyes stayed fixed on the papers, spread across the table, her lips pressed into a thin line. The room stayed silent, every guest caught between disbelief and shame, and I realized I had finally done the one thing I had never dared to do. I had spoken the truth out loud in front of everyone, and there was no way to take it back. Daniel was the first to break the silence. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and asked in a steady voice if what I laid out was true. His eyes scanned the receipts and bank slips, and then he looked straight at Madison. She shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks flushed crimson, and said she had no idea. My mother finally found her voice weak and wavering. She said she thought I was only helping here and there, nothing serious, just small contributions. I could not stop myself from laughing bitterly. I told her those small contributions were the reason the house was still standing, the reason Dad could come home from the hospital without facing a foreclosure notice taped to the front door. Uncle Henry coughed into his napkin. Aunt Margaret murmured that she had never known, and Mrs. Coleman whispered to her husband that she had suspected something, but never thought it was this. The room felt heavy with eyes on me, but for the first time in years I did not shrink away. Madison cleared her throat and tried to redirect the moment, saying this was not the time or place, that Christmas dinner should not be turned into an argument. I snapped my head toward her and told her Christmas dinner had been bought and paid for with my money, my sleepless nights, my empty savings account. I told her that if she wanted a celebration, she should at least acknowledge who had made it possible. Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked at Madison again, his voice sharper this time, asking how she could not know what was happening in her own family. Madison's lips trembled. She started to say she had been busy, that her work consumed her, that she assumed everything at home was fine. That word fine set me off. I asked her if she thought bills paid themselves, if she thought the mortgage company sent holiday greetings instead of late notices, if she believed flowers delivered to a hospital room kept the lights on. My voice shook with years of anger, but it was steady enough for everyone in that room to hear clearly. Mom tried to interrupt, telling me to lower my voice, but I ignored her. I pulled out the statement for Dad's prescriptions, the deposit slip for the mortgage, the receipt for the catering service, and laid them one by one on the table like cards in a game no one could win. Each paper landed with a soft thud, but together they felt like hammer blows. Madison sat back in her chair, her eyes glistening, unable to look at me. Daniel rubbed his temple, muttering that this was unbelievable. Relatives shifted in their seats, the air thick with discomfort. Dad's voice, weak but steady, cut through the tension. He told everyone that I had been there every day, that I had carried the weight when he could not, that without me they might have lost the house already. He looked at me with pride, his hand trembling as he lifted his glass in my direction. That small gesture sent a lump into my throat, so strong I could barely swallow. My mother covered her face with her hands. For the first time, she looked small, stripped of the pride she always wrapped around herself when speaking of Madison. She whispered that she had been wrong, but her words were drowned by the murmurs of relatives who were already digesting the truth. Mrs. Coleman spoke up from the far end of the table. She said it was shameful that a daughter who sacrificed so much could be dismissed so easily. She said the neighborhood had always heard about Madison's victories, but never once had she heard about the daughter who was keeping the family afloat. Her words landed harder than any I had spoken, because they came from someone outside the family circle. Madison finally rose from her seat, her chair scraping against the floor. She said she needed some air, and walked out into the hallway, Daniel following close behind. The front door opened and shut with a thud, leaving a hollow silence in their wake. I stayed standing, my hands pressed against the table, my chest heaving with the force of everything I had held back for so long. The candles flickered, the smell of roasted turkey hung in the air, but the warmth of the evening was gone. Instead, the truth had settled into every corner of that dining room, impossible to ignore. My mother sat rigidly in her chair, tears streaking down her cheeks. Relatives avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the papers spread across the table. Dad reached for my hand and gave it a squeeze, his eyes soft with pride and sorrow. I knew nothing would be the same after this night. The words could not be unsaid, the proof could not be unseen. The dinner that was meant to honor one daughter had instead revealed the silent strength of another. I slowly gathered the receipts and slipped them back into my folder. My hands were steadier than I expected. When I looked around the table, I saw not pity but respect in the eyes of some, discomfort in the eyes of others, and shame in the eyes of the woman who had raised me. Without saying another word, I lowered myself back into my chair. The chatter did not return. Forks scraped plates half-heartedly, glasses were lifted without toasts, and the glow of Christmas dinner had dimmed to a heavy quiet. The truth had finally been spoken, and though it had shattered the evening, I felt strangely lighter than I had in years. Daniel's voice carried from the hallway before the front door even clicked shut. He was demanding answers from Madison, his words sharp and quick. Everyone at the table heard the muffled argument, though no one moved to interrupt. My mother sat frozen, her eyes locked on her wineglass, as if the bottom of it might hold an escape. A minute later, the door opened again, and Daniel stepped back into the dining room. His expression was tight, the charm he had carried all evening stripped away. He asked Madison directly in front of everyone if she truly had no idea what was happening at home. Madison's hands shook as she tried to answer. She said she was buried in work, that she trusted Mom to tell her. If anything was wrong, that she never imagined I would be the one paying everything. I told her that ignorance was not the same as innocence. She had been too busy shining to notice when the people around her were drowning. My words made her flinch. Daniel shook his head, clearly disgusted. He looked at me then, almost apologetically, and said he admired my strength. That single line made Madison's cheeks flush even deeper. She shot me a glare that mixed shame with anger, as if my truth had betrayed her more than her silence had betrayed me. The relatives began whispering again, their eyes darting between the three of us. Uncle Henry asked quietly if it was really true, if I had covered the mortgage and hospital bills. I pushed the folder of receipts toward him and told him to look for himself. He picked up a page, read it, and nodded slowly, his lips pressed tight. Aunt Margaret murmured to her neighbor that it was shameful, a daughter being treated like a servant while carrying the family on her back. Mom finally tried to regain control of the room. She said in a trembling voice that families should not air dirty laundry in front of guests. I snapped back that it was not dirty laundry when the truth was clean and undeniable. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow outside. Madison rose from her chair, her hands clenched into fists. She accused me of humiliating her in front of Daniel, in front of everyone. She said I could have talked to her privately, that I had chosen this moment to ruin her night. I felt my own temper rise, but I kept my voice even. I told her it was never about her night. It was about years of mine. Daniel stood then, straightening his jacket, his expression cold. He said he needed some air, and walked out again, this time alone. Madison looked stricken, caught between following him and staying to defend herself. She chose silence, sinking back into her chair with her eyes downcast. I sat back down too, but I did not lower my gaze. For the first time, I looked across that table at every face staring back at me, and I did not feel small. I felt steady. The meal limped along after that, but no one tasted much. Plates were pushed aside, half-full glasses refilled without cheer. The only sound was the occasional scrape of silverware against porcelain. Dad's hand found mine under the table and squeezed a silent message that he was proud of me. That was the only warmth I felt in that room. When the evening finally ended, guests left quickly, muttering their goodbyes. Some hugged me tightly, whispering that I was brave, while others avoided my eyes. Madison slipped out quietly without saying another word, her coat draped over her shoulders like a shield. I helped Dad back to his recliner before I left. He whispered that the truth had needed to be spoken, even if it hurt. Mom lingered in the kitchen, stacking plates with jerky movements, her face pale. I could feel her shame pressing against me, but she still could not bring herself to say thank you. The cold air outside felt cleaner than anything in that house. I walked to my car, my boots crunching against the snow, my breath clouding the night. For once, I did not feel like the forgotten daughter driving away unnoticed. The silence in my chest had been replaced by something fierce and unshakable. I started the engine, the headlights, casting long beams across the empty street, and I realized that Christmas would never be the same again. The next morning I woke up with a heaviness that clung to me like damp air. My phone buzzed non-stop with messages from cousins and neighbors. Some told me I was brave, others said they wished I had kept things private, but no one denied the truth of what I had laid out. I scrolled through the texts in silence, setting the phone down when the weight of their opinions became too much. By noon, I drove over to my parents' house to check on Dad. The driveway was already cleared, though I knew it was not Daniel who had done it. The front door creaked open, and Mom appeared, her face pale, eyes puffy from lack of sleep. She stepped aside without a word, and I walked in. The house smelled faintly of leftover turkey and pine, but the festive glow was gone. Dad sat in his recliner, wrapped in a blanket. He smiled when he saw me, his voice raspy, but warm, as he asked if I was holding up. I nodded, pretending to be steady, though my hands shook as I set a grocery bag on the counter. Mom busied herself with dishes, not once meeting my eyes. The silence stretched until Dad finally said that what happened the night before was long overdue. His words hung in the air, sharp against the clinking of dishes. Mom froze, then turned slowly, her lips pressed tight. She whispered that I had humiliated her in front of family and neighbors. I told her I had not humiliated her. She had done that herself by ignoring what was right in front of her. Her shoulders sagged, but she did not reply. Instead, she walked back into the kitchen and left me with Dad. He reached for my hand and squeezed it. He told me he was proud that sometimes the truth had to come out, even if it broke people open. His words steadied me more than he knew. Later that afternoon, as I was leaving, Madison pulled into the driveway. She stepped out of her car, her coat wrapped tight around her, her eyes red. For a moment, she just stood there, unsure whether to walk past me or stop. I opened my car door, but she called my name. Her voice was thin, brittle. She asked if we could talk. We stood by the edge of the driveway, snow crunching under our boots. She admitted she was blindsided by what I revealed, that she never realized how much I had been doing. She said Mom never told her anything, and that she assumed Dad's insurance covered most of it. I told her assumptions were a luxury she could afford because someone else was paying the price. Her face crumpled, but she did not argue. Daniel's car pulled up behind hers. He got out slowly, his expression unreadable. He greeted me politely, then turned to Madison, asking if she had told me yet. She shook her head. He sighed and said he was struggling with what he had learned, that he needed to know if he was marrying someone who could ignore her own family's suffering. Madison burst into tears, insisting she had not known that she had been drowning in work and wedding plans. I stood quietly, the icy air burning my cheeks while their conversation spilled into the driveway. For the first time, Madison was not the one being admired or praised. She was the one defending herself, scrambling to explain away the silence. When I finally got into my car, Daniel stopped me. He said he respected me for stepping up, for doing what no one else did. He said families reveal themselves in crisis, and I had shown who I really was. I thanked him, though the words felt heavy because they carried both validation and pity. Driving home, I realized the cracks in Madison's perfect image were widening, not because of me alone, but because the truth had finally caught up to her. I had not set out to destroy her, only to free myself, but now the consequences were rippling through every part of our family. That evening, my phone rang again. This time it was Aunt Margaret. She said she wanted me to know that the family saw me differently now, that they finally understood what I had carried. Her words were kind, but they also left me feeling hollow. It should not have taken public shame for my worth to be recognized. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my apartment, staring at the twinkling lights of the small tree in the corner. The decorations looked cheerful, but I felt nothing. The house I had saved, the parents I had carried, the sister who had always been lifted above me, all of it had shifted in one night. I leaned back on the couch, closed my eyes, and let the silence settle. For the first time in years, I was not just the overlooked daughter. I was the one who had spoken, the one who had forced the truth into the open. And whether they liked it or not, nothing could ever return to the way it was before. The weeks after Christmas passed, in a blur of strained phone calls and uneasy silences. Mom hardly spoke to me, unless it was about Dad's appointments or groceries. When she did, her tone was clipped, as though each word was pulled from her unwilling mouth. Dad, on the other hand, grew gentler, asking about my clients and urging me to take care of myself. His gratitude was quiet, but constant, a reminder that at least one parent finally saw me clearly. Madison kept her distance. I did not hear from her until mid-January, when her number flashed on my phone one evening. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was hesitant, soft, and for the first time in years she did not sound confident or rehearsed. She asked if we could meet. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We sat across from each other at a coffee shop near downtown Columbus. The clatter of cups and low hum of conversation filled the air between us. Madison fidgeted with her napkin, twisting it in her hands until it tore. She admitted that Daniel had been distant since Christmas, that he had questions she did not know how to answer. She confessed that she felt blindsided, embarrassed, even betrayed. I told her I had no intention of destroying her life, that my words at Christmas had not been about her but about my own survival. She nodded, her eyes glistening, and said she believed me. Then she surprised me. She asked how much money I had already spent, how much debt I had taken on. I pulled out a number I had memorized and laid it bare. Nearly $20,000 since summer. Madison's face crumpled. She covered her mouth, shaking her head. She said she wanted to help, that she and Daniel had discussed it, and that, going forward, she would take over Dad's medical bills. I studied her carefully. Part of me wanted to laugh, to remind her that it took public humiliation for her to open her eyes. But another part of me, the tired part, wanted to believe her. I agreed to let her handle the next set of hospital invoices. By February, I began to notice a shift. Dad's rehab appointments were paid on time without me draining my account. Madison even wired money directly into Mom's checking account, something I never thought I would. Mom struggled at first, fumbling with gratitude she was not used to offering. She eventually muttered that she was thankful, though the words still felt foreign in her mouth. My own life began to change, too. The extra time I gained from not carrying every single expense allowed me to focus on larger freelance contracts. I landed a deal with a regional restaurant chain to redesign their branding and digital ads. For the first time, I felt like my business had real momentum. Then, one afternoon, Daniel called me. His voice was calm, almost formal. He said he respected me deeply for what I had done, and admitted he had pressured Madison to step up. He wanted me to know that he had no intention of letting her slide back into ignorance. I thanked him, unsure how to process a compliment from the man who had always seemed just out of my reach, part of a world I never belonged in. When I told Mom about the new contract, she actually smiled. She said it sounded promising, though she quickly added that Madison had just been placed on the fast track to partner at her firm. The old habits were still there, comparisons slipping through like cracks in a dam, but she caught herself and added that she was proud of me too. I held on to that moment, as imperfect as it was. Spring melted into summer, and the bitterness of Christmas slowly loosened its grip. Madison called more often sometimes, to ask about my projects, sometimes to vent about her workload. It felt strange to hear her lean on me, even in small ways. For the first time, I sensed a fragile balance forming between us. Still, the memories of that night lingered. Every time I walked into my parents' house, I saw the spot at the table where I had laid out my receipts. The stunned faces of relatives burned into my mind. The truth had altered everything. It had made space for new respect, but it had also left scars that would never fully heal. In August, Mom surprised me by inviting me to lunch, just the two of us. We sat at a small diner on High Street, the kind of place she never used to enjoy. She folded her menu, her hands fidgeting, and said she owed me an apology. She admitted she had been blind, that her pride in Madison had made her cruel without realizing it. She said she wanted to do better, even if it took time. I listened quietly, my fork tracing circles on the table. Hearing the words I had craved for years should have filled me with relief, but instead I felt a strange emptiness, maybe because the apology came so late, or maybe because I had already learned to stand on my own without it. Still, I nodded and told her I appreciated it. When I left that diner, I realized something had shifted for good. I no longer needed her validation the way I once had. Her words mattered, but they did not define me anymore. By the time autumn leaves painted the streets of Columbus, I had hired an assistant to help with my growing business. I moved into a larger apartment with a small office space. For the first time, my life felt like it belonged to me. Yet even with progress all around me, the memory of Christmas hovered like a shadow, a reminder that truth once spoken never disappears. It lingers, reshaping everything in its path, leaving some things stronger and others broken beyond repair. The first snow of December came early, covering Columbus in a quiet blanket that seemed to soften the world outside my window. I sat at my desk, sipping lukewarm coffee, watching the flakes drift down in slow spirals. It had been nearly a year since the Christmas dinner that tore everything open, and though life had moved forward, the memory was stitched into me like a scar that would never fade. Mom called me that morning. Her voice was steadier than I expected, gentle in a way that caught me off guard. She asked if I would come over to help plan this year's dinner. For a moment I hesitated, memories of standing in front of that crowded table flashing like lightning in my mind. But she kept talking, telling me she wanted something smaller, more intimate, without the showmanship of years past. She said she wanted to spend Christmas with her family, not an audience. That one sentence told me things had shifted more than I realized. When I arrived a week later to help her decorate, the house felt different. The same wreath hung on the door, the same twinkle lights glowed on the porch, but the air inside lacked the old tension. Mom handed me a box of ornaments and asked if I remembered which ones were Dad's favorite. It was such a simple question, but it felt like a truce offering. We hung them together quietly, without the unspoken comparisons that used to hang heavier than the garlands. Dad was stronger now, walking without the walker, though he tired easily. He grinned when he saw me, hugging me longer than usual. He said the house looked brighter with me in it, a comment that made my throat tighten. I caught Mom watching us, her eyes soft in a way I rarely saw before. Madison called that evening while I was still there. I heard her voice through the speaker as she asked what dishes I planned to make this year. Mom laughed and told her we were keeping things simple, then handed me the phone. For a moment I didn't know what to say. Madison filled the silence by telling me she had been thinking about last year too, and she wanted this Christmas to be about healing, not performance. I told her I could live with that. On Christmas Eve, I drove to my parents' house again, a tray of casseroles on the seat beside me. Snow fell in gentle flurries, glittering under the streetlights. When I walked in, the house smelled of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and pine. The table was set, but this time without the crystal goblets or gold chargers. Simple plates, candles, and a red tablecloth set the scene. There were no neighbors, no extended cousins, just the immediate family. Madison and Daniel arrived shortly after. He carried in a pie, and she brought a stack of gifts wrapped neatly in silver paper. She hugged me at the door, her grip tighter than I expected. Daniel greeted me warmly, asking about my design business, and for once, it didn't feel like small talk. Dinner was quieter, almost cautious at first. We passed dishes around, complimented the food, and talked about the snowstorm coming in from the west. But as the evening stretched, laughter began to bubble up again. Dad told stories about his years as principal, stories that made us roll our eyes and chuckle. Even Mom joined in, teasing him gently. After dessert, Mom set her fork down and folded her hands. The room quieted instinctively, as if we all sensed something was coming. She looked at me first, then at Madison, her eyes shining in the candlelight. She said she wanted to apologize again, not just to me, but to the family as a whole. She admitted that she had spent years blinded by pride, lifting one daughter so high that she failed to see the strength of the other. Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop. She said she couldn't undo the years she had spent comparing us, but she could choose to see us clearly now. The silence that followed was heavy, but not crushing. My eyes burned, and Madison reached across the table to take my hand. She whispered that she had needed to hear Mom say it too. Daniel nodded, adding that families were measured not by perfection, but by how they handled their flaws. Dad lifted his glass, then his hand shaking slightly, and toasted to both his daughters. He said he was proud of Madison's achievements and proud of my resilience. His voice cracked, and for a moment no one moved. Then we all raised our glasses together, and the clink of crystal rang like a promise. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the leftovers packed away, Madison and I sat by the fireplace while Daniel and Dad played cards at the table. She admitted that Daniel had almost left her after last year, not because of me, but because he questioned her ability to see what mattered. She said it forced her to look at herself in ways she never had before. She glanced at me, her eyes wet, and said she was grateful I had forced the truth into the light, even if it had been messy. For the first time, I believed her. I told her I wasn't proud of how explosive that night had been, but I was proud that I had finally spoken. She smiled faintly, saying that sometimes families need to be shaken to be rebuilt. When I left that night, snow was falling steadily, coating the street in fresh white. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the cold air, watching my breath curl into the night. The house behind me was the same one I had nearly lost a year ago, but it felt new somehow, like the walls themselves had absorbed the change. Driving home, I thought about how much had shifted. I was no longer the daughter in the shadows, no longer the one who stayed silent while others took up all the space. I had spoken the truth, and while it broke some things, it built others stronger than I ever imagined. This time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. And that was the gift I never expected to find under the glow of Christmas lights. Thank you for listening to my story. Have you ever had a moment when finally speaking up changed your family forever? Share your experience in the comments, and if my story resonated with you, please like and subscribe so you can join me for more stories about truth, resilience, and the strength it takes to be heard.